tonight we've got three alumni of Wadham, who have been involved in different but complementary parts of the struggle to find a vaccine and then to get that vaccine manufactured and rolled out, not just in this country, but across the world. They are in alphabetical order, and you'll have heard from some of them before. Sandy Douglas, who is a research group leader at the now famous Jenner Institute here in Oxford. I'm not going to say what he does because I'm going to ask him and the others to talk about that. We have Rachel Tanner, who's a research fellow at Wolston College, but also a lecturer here in Wadham in human sciences. Her work is focused actually on the TB vaccine, which we'll come back to as a future, but she was also involved in evaluating the immune response for those clinical trials. And then last but not least, Daniel Thornton, who is senior advisor to Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and COVAX, all of which you will have heard a lot about, and we'll hear a little bit more now, was previously a civil servant in the Foreign Office and the Treasury and Number 10. So three alumni from very different backgrounds, academic backgrounds, but doing some really extraordinary things. And I'm going to ask each of them to just say a little about what their role has been, and if they want to then stray into what their biggest challenges are at the moment. I think that will be very interesting for us to hear. And then we'll have a little discussion, and around past, that will open this up to questions from you. So please, if you have questions as they're talking, please put them in the chat, or if you'd like to put your hand up later on, I'll invite people to ask their questions on Zoom, which is always nicer to see people in person if possible. So without further ado, let me ask, first of all, Sandy Douglas, if you would just like to tell us what your role is and what you think the big challenges at the moment are.
Thanks very much. So I've been one of the 6 principal investigators leading the Oxford COVID vaccine programme, along with Sarah Gilbert, Andy Pollard, Adrian Hill, Kath Green and Tess Lamb. And although my own training is actually as a clinical medic, my role in the programme has rather strangely been to lead the scale up of the manufacturing. When the pandemic started, I by chance had been working on a manufacturing method for a rabies vaccine, which my group are making using a similar technology to our COVID vaccine. And that meant that really I was the only person around who had relevant experience of a potentially scalable manufacturing method. So through February, March, April 2020, we took what was originally a very small scale lab process, a couple of tablespoons, and turned that into something that could be done at industrial scale, so 200 litres, a big vat of cells making the vaccine. And in parallel with that, started negotiating partnerships with manufacturers who could make it. So we set up a consortium with 3 different manufacturers in the UK and the Netherlands, plus a large Chinese manufacturer, and also the Serum Institute of India, through February, March 2020. And that then laid the template for distributed manufacturing, which some people will be aware AstraZeneca have used this quite unusual strategy of having manufacturing at multiple different sites all around the world. And that was based on the template that we'd started off in February and March before we partnered with them in May 2020. So that's been my role. With respect to current challenges, to be honest, personally, for me and my research group, things are a lot less stressful than they were early on. Fortunately, I think the heaviest lift for us as a team is thankfully past. Wearing my clinical hat, I've been leading a clinical trial of giving our vaccine intranasally. It's a nasal spray. And I think perhaps that highlights a challenge which is, remains to be solved for this pandemic, or indeed any future one, which is how do we deliver vaccines without needles, without fridges and cold chains, and try and make things much more practical and cost effective for the future.
Thank you very much, Sandy. I'm glad to hear it is slightly less stressful after an extraordinary couple of years. I'm going to come back to Rachel in a second because she was involved in that work here in Oxford. But I wanted to go to Dan because it follows on quite nicely from what you just described, the challenge of then getting this out to the rest of the world. Daniel, could you just say a little bit about what you've been doing and what your current challenge, including fundraising, is?
Thanks very much, Robert. It's good to be here, and it's good to see friends and some of the folks that I was discussing a similar issue with a year ago. And obviously, since then, the pandemic has continued to rage. We've had 20 million dead around the world and countless lives disrupted. Estimates by the IMF that the world economy will have lost 12.5 trillion by 2024, which is $12.5 trillion by 2024, which is an incredible figure. Of course, we're all, as you mentioned, Robert, we're all affected by the pandemic personally, and so these numbers have a kind of immediate reality for us all. And a year ago, the vaccine rollout was only just starting, and the work that Sandy and Rachel have been doing to develop the AstraZeneca vaccine, was a vital part of that. And now 10.5 billion doses have been administered, which is more than half the world's population has had 2 doses. And these vaccines are estimated to have prevented 17 million deaths so far, which is a pretty good impact. And I think reflecting the stress that Sandy and his colleagues were feeling, this is the fastest ever development and scale up of vaccines. In the past, the average period between microbe isolation and vaccine development was 48 years, and in the case of COVID, it was less than a year. And similarly, the time in terms of rolling out the vaccine, the average time between vaccine development and achieving 40% coverage in the world was 42 years, and for COVID, it was achieved in 11 months. But obviously, the kind of as the title of this discussion points to, the vaccines have not been equally distributed. So the organization I work for, COVAX, had a vision when it was set up at the start of the pandemic that 20% of the most vulnerable would be protected wherever they lived. And although we've succeeded in delivering 1 billion vaccines to lower income countries, that hasn't been achieved yet. And perhaps I'll briefly refer to the sort of 3 reasons for that. The first is that COVAX was established soon after the pandemic started, and world leaders met in June 2020 and started pledging funds, and we've raised more than $10 billion so far, which is an impressive sum and massive by comparison to similar fundraising efforts, and unprecedented in a pandemic. But wealthy countries had more money, and that money was available more quickly for them to use to lock in vaccine supplies for their domestic populations, and that had a big impact on the supply available to lower income countries. And then secondly, wealthy countries and also China and India had vaccine development and production on their own territory, and that affected the distribution of vaccines. So for example, until April 2021, India allowed exports of its vaccines, but the pandemic outbreak there stopped this, and that had a big impact on COVAX's supplies of vaccines. So I think in terms of vaccine equality, vaccines have been made available in a kind of income cascade, starting with high income countries, then upper middle income countries have achieved full coverage, and now boosters being rolled out. Lower middle income countries are now at 50% coverage. But coverage rates along the poorest countries, low income countries, have not yet hit 10%. And that means many elderly people and healthcare workers are not protected, which leads to the third set of reasons which relate to the challenges of running immunization programs in lower income countries, because the goal, of course, is vaccinations and not just vaccines. Not just achieving equality of supply, but achieving equity in outcomes by raising coverage levels everywhere. And running immunization programs is challenging anywhere, because vaccines are rightly highly regulated products and need to be stored at the right temperature and so on. But of course, there are particular challenges in lower income countries. You need special syringes so you don't spread bloodborne diseases, which are also in short supply. You know, the logistics of reaching remote populations and making sure healthcare workers are reliably paid. And crucially, I think on the supply side, we haven't made it easy for lower income countries. So too many of the billion doses, whether purchased by COVAX or donated by wealthy countries, came late in the year. And we delivered more in December than we did in the whole first half of the year. And that made it very hard for countries to plan their supply. So I think our work is really not nearly done. There's been, sadly, a new variant on average every 4 months since the pandemic started, and I don't think there's any reason to think that the next one will be less virulent or transmissible. Just as Delta was worse than Alpha, there's every chance that it will be worse. The next variant will be worse than Omicron. So wealthy countries have a wall of immunity which may protect us against that, but that wall needs to carry on being built in lower income countries, which means having steady supplies over the coming months, and potentially new sorts of vaccines. And Sandy, we're watching the nasal spray trials with great interest, because that obviously could have a big impact, both as a easier way of transmitting the vaccine, administering the vaccine, but also helping reduce transmission. Our work is really not done, and we're trying to raise at least $5.2 billion to really tackle the next phase of the pandemic in lower income countries, which I think is also about putting in place the infrastructure for the next pandemic. And perhaps that's something we can talk about more in questions.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I wanted to come back to exactly that, the future, and also to come back to equity. I think both you and Sandy have highlighted nicely the central role of Oxford, actually. It was the AstraZeneca vaccine that made that, albeit slower than we would have liked, spread of vaccine possible, as John Bell, I think, pointed out recently. So I wanted to come back to you both on that. Before I do, though, I just wanted to ask Rachel what it was like in those early days being involved in the labs, if you like, because I know this wasn't your day job. I mean, you're actually you're here to do something which is much longer term around a TB vaccine, and you got pulled into this. Could you just give us a sense of what that was like when we were all sitting at home worrying about other things?
Yeah, so I guess rewinding, before distribution was an issue, before we even knew whether we had an effective vaccine, I started working on evaluating immune responses. That's looking in volunteer blood before and after they got the vaccine in the first 2 clinical trials of the Oxford vaccine. And yes, as Robert said, I don't belong to Sarah Gilbert's group. I work on TB, but it was basically all hands on deck in the Jenner. So if people had appropriate experience, sufficient experience in particular immune assays, then we were asked if we'd be willing to be seconded to that COVID work. And specifically, I was looking at T-cell responses. So everyone hears a lot about antibody responses with good reason, because they're central to a protective immune response, but T-cells likely also have an important role to play. And so my main job was processing blood, so separating it into its constituent components of white blood cells and serum and so on, and then using the white blood cells to look at those T-cell responses to different parts of the virus in terms of their magnitude and kinetic over time after vaccination. And yeah, in terms of what it was like, it was really intense. So to put it into context, normally when we process trial samples, we have sort of 1 to 3 volunteers in a day. And previously, if we had 5, that used to seem like a heavy day, whereas this was kind of 50 to 100 in a single day. And so that meant scaling up the number of people, the amount of space, capacity, equipment. We had new freezers delivered, because obviously you've got hundreds of thousands of vials to store down. And yeah, it was just quite high pressure, but everybody there was really good camaraderie, and everyone just knew the kind of urgency and importance of getting the job done, I guess.
Thank you very much. And I think your point about scale up is a nice segue to Sandy, because that was sort of your responsibility, Sandy. And I wonder if you could reflect, maybe ask all three of you in different ways to reflect on, before we go to the future, what could have been done differently? What could have been done to do this, to scale up faster and more effectively? What would you change looking back when you go to the next pandemic? Sandy, do you want to have a go at that first?
Well, I think things will be quicker if, God forbid, there is another pandemic in the relatively near future. Things will be quicker. We've learned a lot about how to do this efficiently, and we know a lot more about the vaccine platform technologies that could be used to make a vaccine against a future emerging virus as well. I think, with other than learning what could be done differently, well, I think we could have moved faster had we had relatively small amounts of money earlier. And I'm talking in February and March 2020. It really didn't feel as though anyone had woken up to quite the enormity of the challenge, and quite how enormously beneficial it would be every day sooner a vaccine was available. So, you know, rather than billions of pounds, I'm talking about tens or hundreds of thousands of pounds very early on would have made a difference in the early stages. I think, you know, the UK got a lot of things right. Actually, the UK Vaccines Task Force, I think, did a fantastic job, and we can talk a bit more if people are interested about, you know, how that came to be and what it was that they did that was effective, and also the UK regulators and ethics system, which allow us to get clinical trials started safely, but also respecting all the usual standards of volunteer safety and ethics. The regulators and ethics system was incredibly responsive, and I think it's very important that we remember how important it is to have those robust systems to get research done quickly in future.
Thank you very much, Sandy. I will come back to that point, but Daniel, do you want to, from the international perspective, just pick up that sort of backward looking, what would you have done differently?
Yeah, so I mean, like Sandy, I think the money faster, I think, would have made a big difference. So if we'd had $10 billion in June 2020 instead of June 2021, then we would have been able to protect the most vulnerable people and healthcare workers in lower income countries on the same timetable that rich countries' populations receive that protection. So you need a system in place that triggers that money being released, and that can be done. We have the mechanisms, but it needs upfront commitment now, and it's hard to get that in peacetime. So, or what might feel like peacetime to some governments. So that's the trick. If you wait until you know, heads of government are kind of meeting and authorizing and realizing there's a big problem and realizing it's going to cost a lot of money, and then authorizing the money and then the money being transferred. If you wait for all that, it's too late. So you have to have a trigger for getting the money faster. I think
do you think, sorry to interrupt, but do you think you've won the battle on convincing the rest, or the international community, that actually vaccinating the rest of the world is a key to making us all safer?
I mean, I think there's a pretty good recognition of it. I think probably the appetite will dwindle, and maybe is already dwindling a bit. You know, it's striking that rich countries haven't been prepared to pay for flu vaccines, for example. Although, you know, there would be some impact on, you know, for making those available to lower income countries, but they have until now been prepared to pay for at least some COVID vaccines. And obviously COVID is more serious than the most recent variants of flu, at least. I think the argument is still to be one that we need to sustain the program, and that doesn't mean rich countries paying for everything. I think we need the prices to come down, and we need some contribution from some of the governments as well that are receiving the vaccines. I think that's important to sustain the process. But I'd say, coming back to your previous question about what we should do differently, I mean, you need institutions in place. So we need a COVAX equivalent to be ready to go. I mean, we set it up in April 2020, and if we'd set it up in January 2020, that would have been even better. It felt fast to us, but it wasn't fast enough. And I think a couple of other things that, distributing manufacturing for vaccines around the world much better is really important, because as I mentioned, one of the big constraints has been that it's rich countries, India and China, that have most of the vaccine production, and you really need, in general, more distributed manufacturing, but also small countries with small populations that have manufacturing, so that they can quickly, you can't prevent governments immunizing their own populations in a pandemic situation, but if they can cover their own population quickly, and then you can see those vaccines exported, that would make a big difference. And then finally, you need a surveillance system to see what's coming. At the moment, we're kind of, we're doing this blindfold. If a variant pops up in Africa, it only gets seen when it gets to South Africa, or a couple of other places. So that's a crazy situation for the world to be in, and you need to be watching what's happening.
Thanks very much. I'm going to come back to you, Sandy, particularly on the task force, which you were going to say a little bit more about. But Rachel, back to the biomedical side of this. If you are heavily involved in looking for a TB vaccine, do you look at what's happened over the last 2 years and find optimism for our possibility for developing and distributing a vaccine for TB or HIV or the many other things that we're working on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely shows what can be done with more money and more people and more time and investment. And I think for big challenges like TB, which are predominantly in LMICs, there's a kind of disconnect there in the proportionate amount of R&D investment. And so I think if that was appreciated more, because if you look at the death rates for TB, for example, 1.5 million people still die every year from TB. So it's the biggest infectious killer other than COVID now. But the investment isn't proportional to that. In terms of biology, I think having the viral vector given to so many people is kind of proof of concept in terms of huge amounts of safety data. And also the fact that it can be rolled out logistically in LMICs. So I think that gives promise, because that kind of platform can be easily adapted to other pathogens. There's potential there. In fact, we have some research ongoing using that platform with TB antigens. But there's also, I guess, difficulties in terms of those more complex pathogens. So whereas SARS-CoV-2 has an antigen that you'd immediately go to, the spike protein that covers the surface, it's very immunogenic, it's a very obvious candidate for a vaccine. Something like TB that's more complex, people have been looking for antigens for decades to include in vaccines, and we still don't know which would be the most appropriate and the best at inducing protection. And so even with equal amount of resources thrown at it, I think it might still be longer and more difficult to generate vaccines against some of those other diseases.
And presumably that you're unlikely to get the extraordinary acceleration in time that you got over the last couple of years. Oh, thank you. Sandy, I know we need to move to questions, because I know there will be lots of questions, but Sandy, do you just want to say a little bit more about the vaccine task force? Is this something, and Daniel mentioned institutions, and Rachel's answer was very relevant to this, and how do we do it for TB? Is this something that should be a permanent thing? Is it yeah, what was so good about it, and could we replicate that?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. Are there other problems to which this sort of model could be applied? So what the Vaccines Task Force did was, firstly, actually really, so it came into being, I think, right at the start of May 2020, Kate Bingham was appointed. But in the month preceding that, a Vaccine Task Force-like attitude had come about in government, and really what that meant to us was there was suddenly awareness that they needed to spend lots of money and get the money out the door very quickly in order to avoid delay. And spending several £million to make things happen a bit quicker with respect to vaccine availability was an absolute no-brainer. And that realization, I think, came from Patrick Vallance right at the end of March 2020, and I got a phone call from a chap who was looking after the manufacturing side of things at that point, and having felt it was really quite distressing through February and March 2020. Where are the grown-ups in the room? Where is the scale of response that we need? Suddenly we had connection to government. Within a week or so, I was asked to pitch a plan for UK supply for tens of millions of pounds to a minister, and then within a week of that, we had an email saying, "Yeah, go ahead." And that scale of ambition hadn't been there until that point. Once the VTF itself was formed, it combined that with an amalgamation really of three strands of expertise, one from government and civil service, but then also from outside, commercial and investment nous, and also technical and scientific expertise from industry and academia specific to biotech. Kate Bingham's job is she's a biotech venture capitalist. Her job is to make decisions about which biotech innovations are good investments. And that's a good person to have making decisions about where to put your money. And it meant with that experience, she was able to take a very pragmatic, realistic approach. I think she said herself that she was conscious we weren't the biggest customer in the world for the Pfizers or Modernas or whoever. So the only way we were going to get access to vaccine relatively early was by making ourselves a very good customer. How could we help them? And some people might feel a bit uncomfortable with that, and there's certainly ethical questions about the UK having jumped ahead in the queue versus other countries. But that approach was very effective, I think, and it contrasted with some of the other funders we dealt with, who were, when we were trying to get money in March 2020, there was really quite a lot of caution and delay, and well, show us your step-by-step Gantt chart, and what about the design of this ferret, this small animal study, and what about clause 7.3 about equitable access? And that actually they were quite aggressive, some of the funders, about equitable access, to the point we were worried about whether a commercial partner would accept those terms subsequently. So the VTF was able to be very pragmatic and realistic and deal with the individual situation facing an individual company or university developers and make it work for them.
Thank you very much. It's really interesting. We might come back to the equitable access. I hadn't realised that had actually caused some problems, as well as being something you were aiming for. I'm conscious questions are stacking up. I've got one direct one here and one to everyone. Let me then open it up for questions that I'll ask you right at the end for some more personal views. The first is very political, so feel free not to answer it, but it's about Brexit. Has Brexit had a substantial influence, positive or negative, on your own work or your own organization's COVID work? Perhaps start with Daniel on this, because
perhaps choose another panelist if you wouldn't mind.
Okay. Yes, that might be tricky for you. Anybody want to talk about this? Sandy.
I could. I mean, I think, as I said, I think the UK government, once it woke up to this, actually did a pretty good job on vaccine development and procurement. You know, and it people will know it went its own way, independent of the EU. Whether that was attributable to Brexit or not, people can make their own minds up. You know, do you think the UK might well have gone its own way rather than signing up to a common EU procurement system anyway, personally. And with respect to the speed of clinical trials, it's not relevant. You know, the regulation of clinical trials, that our applications have always been reviewed within the UK by the UK MHRA, the regulator.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very diplomatic. Rachel, there's one for you which I referred to earlier because I thought it would be a popular question, and one I'm very interested in is, there's been talk of a pan-COVID or even pan-viral vaccine. Do you believe such vaccines are plausible?
It might be
Lee, so William.
Sandy might have more to say on this, but I have read about people trying to develop one based on kind of computer algorithms predicting what the next variant will be, the most likely next variant will be, or predicting a combination of future variants and then designing it according to those. So there's that kind of in silico approach that I've read about, but beyond that, Sandy's probably better placed to comment.
Thanks, Sandy. Anything to add on that? Is it plausible at all?
I don't know. It's not a very brave answer, is it? But I think there's a reasonable chance it would be possible. So if you look at the spike proteins, the bits of the virus that all the major vaccines induce an immune response against, there are some shared bits between SARS-CoV-2, the COVID-19 virus, and SARS-CoV-1, which caused the original SARS outbreak in Hong Kong, the Far East in early 2000s. So I think there's probably enough what people call antigenic conservation, enough similarity to certainly achieve some broadening of the protection. The sort of counter argument to that would be people have been trying to make pan-flu vaccines for a long time, and it's really, really hard. I think the interesting difference is that with COVID-19, we're potentially a little bit ahead of the curve. It hasn't felt like we've been ahead at any point, but there isn't quite the same massive diversity in the circulating virus as there is with flu.
And while you're on 60 seconds, then does that apply to common colds? Is the vaccine with common cold feasible?
I think probably not. So again, there's this problem of variability. There's also this interesting thing that we're coming to understand more and more. It's now really common knowledge for a relatively informed person in the street that it's much easier to vaccinate against severe disease and stop people being hospitalized and dying than it is to stop transmission. So we really don't understand, what the relationship between a widespread use of a vaccine that stops severe disease and future diversity. It's not going. I don't think we're very likely to stop COVID from circulating, even with very high levels of vaccine coverage and anything like the current vaccines.
Thank you. Couple for Daniel. One is about whether a fund has been established. This is from David Greenslade, an emergency fund. I'm guessing the answer to that is probably not, because you're in the process of trying to raise 5.2 billion, but for the future, that question is. But the other question, which I think everybody might want to have a go at some stage, is about vaccine hesitancy, which is obviously a very interesting and topical subject, particularly after Djokovic's news headlines this morning. And this is from Stacey Hoffhaus. What are some of the ranges of reasons for vaccine hesitancy, and particularly in low-income countries? And is COVAX working with people on the ground to come up with strategies to overcome that hesitancy? Can you give any examples? So it's a really interesting, and Rachel, you might have some views too on hesitancy in here as well. But Daniel, you go first on either of those.
Great, thank you. Yes, so there hasn't been an emergency fund established, but there should be, and I think the key thing is, you know, it's not a fund that has to be. It doesn't have to be money sitting in a bank account, but it has to be, you know, have the ability to call on funds or trigger, you know, release funds, perhaps through, you know, issuing bonds or something like that, you know, against a stream of income. So, you know, we need to have those mechanisms in place. Just on vaccine hesitancy, I think, I mean, I think it is worth looking at some of the Eastern European members of the European Union on this, because they've had supply, but their coverage rates are really low in some cases. So Bulgaria, I think, is 20% or something, and they've had pretty good opportunities to have, you know, the same vaccines that France and Germany have had. And that's really down to vaccine hesitancy. So if we are going to see that level of hesitancy in lower income countries, that's going to be really devastating for those countries. And it certainly is the case that there has been some hesitancy up until now, but it's been hard to tell because the supply has been so constrained that you know, we haven't had the opportunity for hesitancy to be the constraining factor. We know that the things that heads of government say about vaccines in rich countries has an impact on lower income countries, and it's important that you know, that people in power say responsible things about vaccines. In terms of what we do about it, there's a kind of you know, we work with social media companies to make sure that people get good messages about vaccines. You know, and those can be targeted in particular countries where the particular conspiracy theories are happening. But in the end, it's got to be a community approach, you know, much more, you know, based around clinics and the right communication from trusted people in communities, whether it's religious leaders or political leaders or whoever they might be. So that's a big job to be done over the coming months and even years.
And thank you, Dan. And I think you sort of half answered a question from Julia Banfield on was the ranking of COVID vaccines by manufacturer in the press harmful to their take-up? Is that what you meant by unhelpful political comments? But you should say a bit more about that.
Well, I mean, Sandy and Rachel will be able to comment much better on the relative efficacy of the vaccines, but basically they're all, you know, all the vaccines that have been approved by the World Health Organization are good vaccines, and they are effective at stopping severe disease and death, and those are both pretty important things to stop. You know, so I think you know, some of the companies have been quite effective about marketing themselves as dramatically more effective than the others. Not necessarily with you know, with much basis from my perspective, but again, this is where Sandy and Rachel should be commenting and not me.
Okay, let me ask. Thank you, Dan. I mean, Rachel, a question about vaccine hesitancy, because you must get asked this a lot, and it's amazing that even in a place like Oxford, even in a college like Wadham, there are people who are reluctant to take the vaccine to the point of not taking it. What do you say to people on a sort of personal basis?
Yeah, it's an interesting one actually, because I supervised an undergraduate dissertation a couple of years ago from a Wadham student who was looking at vaccine hesitancy for the MMR vaccine which again is becoming an increasing issue, I think, off the back of COVID vaccine hesitancy. Uptake of MMR rates have gone down as well in the UK. And so he did a critical review of the literature, and actually the findings were quite interesting in that not all of what appears to be vaccine hesitancy is necessarily vaccine hesitancy. And a lot of it could be associated with poor access, so association with socio-demographic or socioeconomic background, and not just access to healthcare for the vaccines, but access to information and ability to read and interpret that information. And I think a lot of those findings from high-income countries where vaccine hesitancy is kind of stemming from will be useful to apply when we start looking at LMICs as well, which obviously people have more access issues.
Thank you very much. That is really helpful. And I get to probably lob you the one from William Berners-Lee on the merits of combining flu and COVID vaccines. But let me before I do that, hand one to Sandy, which is from Moshin Khan. An interesting question about what can we do to speed up regulatory and ethical processes for vaccine trials without compromising ethics, safety? But that's pretty much what you were trying to do. So what would you do for the future on that?
Yeah, I mean, without wanting to get too technical into the details of particular regulations, the first thing is to make sure the regulators and the ethics committees are well resourced. You know, the reason it's about time. You know, one of the most important things is how quickly they react to your request. And one of the main reasons that we were able to move quickly was that this was given priority over everything else. And that, you know, if they've got enough people on the job, they can turn around an application in 24 hours. And that just makes an enormous difference to how quickly products can get to people and start to help them. So I think it's important that government recognises that it's a very good public health investment to resource these systems well. I think the other thing, I think there's an interesting area around a sort of tipping point, the transition between late stage clinical trials and deployment, where you already have strong enough evidence that an informed person might well take a judgment that the benefits of using a vaccine or another product exceed the risks, but that there isn't yet quite the overwhelming burden of evidence that's required by regulators to sign it off and say, go forth and market this product, you've got a license. I think there is scope to try and develop mechanisms to get more products to patients in that sort of transition period, in a sort of clinical trial light type framework.
Thank you. I'm just racing to get through all these. The question from Michael Guy, which Rachel, you or Sandy might want to answer, which is about the current research. Is progress being made on why some people are badly affected by COVID and some have few or no symptoms? Very relevant here in college, actually, where we've had this conversation almost every day as to why there's no apparent pattern to this. But is research showing something else?
Rachel?
I was just going to say that we're currently doing a controlled infection study in our group. So giving people a dose of virus, people who have already previously been infected, and then looking at tracking their immune response basically from the second infection over time, and also looking at how that relates to clinical, so for example, symptoms. So I think there'll be some interesting findings from that.
Okay, thank you. So too early to be definitive. A related one from Nick Kirkbride. What ways might a new variant be worse than Omicron? Is transmissibility selected over morbidity?
Shall I have a stab at it?
Yeah, please do.
I'm going to try and be a bit, perhaps a little bit more optimistic. I really hesitate to say it because we've all had so many nasty surprises through the pandemic. I don't think a new variant is likely to be worse than certainly worse than, I don't think it's going to be worse than Delta in terms of public health impact, because most places around the world, there is now some level of population immunity, whether that's come from vaccination or just from the vast majority of people in the population having been exposed to the virus naturally. So we're now moving into a situation much more like seasonal flu, where the virus is infecting people who have some degree of relevant immunity rather than people who are completely naive to it. So yeah, I'm sure we will see more variants. They may be more transmissible than Omicron, although it's getting pretty close to, you know, what some people say might be the limit for this type of virus. But I'd be surprised if it's as bad in terms of public health impact. I hope not.
Well, that is reassuring to hear. One for Daniel, which is really about the health infrastructure, actually, and Sandy and Rachel too, the health infrastructure in developing countries. Is it really possible to do what you're doing without raising the baseline generally for healthcare in those countries? I mean, you already mentioned, Daniel, the personnel, the ability to keep things at the right temperature. The task is more than about manufacturing, scaling up, and delivering vaccine in the end.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And health systems is a subject that Gavi's been grappling with since it was founded sort of 22 years ago. And obviously World Health Organization has been working on it since it was founded too. I think there are inevitably a lot of challenges. You know, if a government doesn't fully control its territory, how do you get vaccines to the parts of the country that aren't controlled? It is possible, but it is an extra level of challenge. I think, you know, more optimistically, I think immunization, certainly childhood immunization, has been something that has achieved high levels of coverage in lower income countries, sometimes higher than in high income countries, where other health interventions haven't been successful. And I think it is different often to find somebody and to immunize them once or maybe twice than to try and treat somebody over a prolonged period for a disease. It's a simpler intervention, and therefore it is possible to do more with immunization than it is with other health interventions. And the key thing really is that immunization then is a kind of bridgehead for other things. And when you're, you know, meeting somebody to immunize them, can you also you know, give them advice about other health matters, or bringing them into into clinics or whatever for treatment. So that's really what we aim to do. And what remains to be seen is whether COVID and the massive scale of that can have that sort of impact across populations. We need to. There's a risk that COVID interventions are kind of a parallel track and have no long-term benefit to health systems, but we've got to make sure that they do, and that this is a kind of a shock to the world. That means, yes, we need to take health systems everywhere as a high priority, because all of our health is affected if there is a black spot somewhere in the world where diseases can get established and spread.
That is an optimistic thought on which to end. That actually COVID might lead to a raising of the baseline of healthcare in the developing world. I'm going to. I know Sandy has to go to another Zoom in about 3 minutes, so I'm going to ask our three panelists, just starting with Sandy, and then please drop off, Sandy, with our thanks. What are your hopes in sort of 30 seconds for the next year and beyond? What would you really like to happen? Sandy.
I'm going to look beyond the next year and say that I hope that by the time, if we have another pandemic, we will have well-resourced, internationally distributed manufacturing centres ready to go, with the raw materials and ready to roll when the pandemic arrives, and that fund that others have mentioned set up in advance and ready to resource things. I think people realise now that manufacturing and scarcity of supply is such an important constraint.
Thanks, Sandy. And I know you've got to go, so thank you on behalf of everyone here, both for taking the time tonight and more importantly for all you've been doing over the last 2 years. We really appreciate it, and we're very proud of what all the panelists tonight have been doing. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed.
And good luck. Rachel, your hopes for the next few years? I know they will be partly focused on TV, but I'm sure other things too.
Yeah, I think you can probably guess just that there's a equal effort and investment in other major public health challenges, especially other major infectious diseases, and that they don't get left behind as a result of the pandemic, because it's really set back the efforts. For example, for TB, it's set back those goals by years or even decades as a result of neglect during the pandemic.
Thank you very much. And Daniel, some hopes to end on.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that the acceleration of vaccine technology we've seen during the pandemic means that this is a golden age for vaccines, and that the vaccines that Rachel is working on, but others too, do become available and have the health impact that they can, which could be dramatic. And I think otherwise, what Sandy said is very much also my agenda.
Absolutely great. Thank you very much. I couldn't ask for a more optimistic way to end from the three of you. I promised to end by 7, and I will. I just wanted to conclude by obviously thanking Rachel and Sandy and Daniel for taking the time. I know you're under a lot of pressure, even though you say it's eased, it's still very high pressure. So thank you very much for that time. But more importantly, thank you for what you're doing. I think the college is incredibly proud of what you've done and are doing. So, and you will see that reflected, I think, in the many comments here and online and in our newsletter. So thank you. And I'm going to hand over to Julie. I should also thank the excellent development team, as always, Salome and Rachel, for setting this up. Thank you above all to all the alumni for joining us from different parts of the world. It makes a huge difference seeing you, and thank you for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get quite all of them, but a very rich discussion anyway. Julie, over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Daniel and Rachel and Sandy, for such an incredibly illuminating discussion. I think we all feel very lucky, but also very touched by what you've shared with us tonight. And we certainly look forward to sharing it also in the recorded version with alumni around the world. We're thrilled to see so many of you again in this new year. And we do march on and hope to see you for our virtual events as the year unfolds. We have another virtual event, and we will continue with this virtual program over the coming year. On the 9th of March, our professor in English and world literature, Anki Mukherjee, is hosting an event about poverty, psychoanalysis, and the poor in the unseen cities around the world. So do join us for that. We are also, perhaps slightly naively, already lining up for in-person events. So the 90 to 93 matriculation Gordy will be hosted in April in college. So a real reunion of the old school kind, we hope. And we're also beginning to organize events in North America. So hoping to rally alumni in New York and San Francisco in March, early April. And then we are, of course, hoping that this summer, at the very latest, we can welcome you all back for opening of our new buildings, show you around. Thank you all for what you've done for the college over the last many years. And finally, we are here in college. It's open for business, for visits, for a walk around the gardens, a cup of coffee or a tour of the new buildings. So if you find yourselves here, do come and visit. But stay well. Thank you for joining us, and see you very soon, we hope.